Documenting the Radical Leftist Agenda Part 2. Now, there's a lot of information here, so I'm just going to jump right in. In Part 1, we reviewed the Cloward-Piven Strategy for Manufactured Crisis. We talked about Frances Fox Piven, her husband Richard Cloward. We introduced Acorn, Obama, and the Project Vote Connection. And then we introduced the Center for Popular Democracy as the new Acorn. And that's where we're going to pick up today. Now, when I say the new Acorn, I'm not just being sarcastic. When you have an organization that's comprised of the same individuals, the same funders, the same partners, working on the same issues with the same tactics, you have a new organization in name only. And that's exactly what we have with CPD. Now, as you can see, a lot of the CPD leadership is made up of Acorn partners and former Acorn allies, and this goes on for a couple of pages. And I even have an appendix section where you can dig into the connections between these people, their new organizations, and CPD. So we're going to start here as the reach, what the reach is for CPD. So when you think about the reach of Acorn, and which you can see here from the archives, and you look at this from the annual report, you'll see that these same organizations and affiliates are spread out in pretty much the same way as Acorn was. And when you add in Acorn International and Wade Rathke, you have a group of connected individuals that are all over the world right now, pushing the same agenda, manufactured crisis, and moving in lockstep. That's important. So why now? Why does this matter right now at this very moment? Well, the answer to that lies with Frances Fox Piven. Piven sits on the board of the Strategic Advisory Council for the Center for Popular Democracy. She still believes that her idea of manufactured crisis, of using the weight of the poor, and in this case, the minorities, will be able to collapse the system. So the reason why this is important at this very moment is because these groups are working together to make this happen. Are we not in crisis right now? Is there not an agenda being pushed? Do we not see cities burning on TV? Do we not see protests labeled as peaceful going on for 60 plus days? These are all part of the agenda, and it goes back to the National Welfare Rights Organization and George Wiley of the 60s. Wiley hired Wade Rathke, a charismatic community organizer, and sent him to Little Rock, Arkansas, to organize people. Now, this was great for Wiley because Wade, now besides being charismatic, he knew how to talk to people. He would go into the communities and he would ask people and not tell them what they needed to do. He would give a voice to the voiceless. He would make them feel powerful. And that's how he was able to organize Black, white, middle class, and poor people all together. They realized that welfare was a polarizing issue, but a group like Acorn, started by a group of friends who came together with the same ideology, could make something happen. And that's exactly what Wade Rathke did. They started using the poor. They started applying pressure points. Now, in a movie called The Organizer, which journals the story of Wade Rathke in the founding of Acorn and its demise, Rathke says that it's a fantasy to think that Acorn could start a revolution in this country. But he said that if they could go in and they could fill all the prerequisites, if they could put everything in place, all of their people, their funding, the resources, the training to make it happen, then if there was ever a situation, a moment in time where it favored the movement, sort of like what we have right now, then Acorn and its people would be able to step in and take what he called the power laying around on the street, the power vacuum. And that's how manufactured crisis work. It's incremental. You don't destroy the system altogether. It's just little taps at the pillars that hold society together. And that's exactly what they've been doing for all of these years. When you think about it, they're using that pain, that anger, that sense of, people who want equality and justice, and they're using that for their own advantage. So when you look at these groups and, the mission statements of them, it all seems just like they're just trying to help people. And you just get the feeling of, they're just doing the right thing. But if you look deeper, especially when you look at who that they're organizing around, which is Saul Alinsky, you begin to understand why all of this comes together the way it does. Alinsky has a movie, there's a movie about Alinsky called Saul Alinsky Went to War. And he goes into Rochester, New York after the race riots. They brought him in to settle down all the racial tensions and everything else. But Alinsky had another idea. he began to have more protests, getting the people out there, holding meetings, and they began shaking down certain companies. He went after Kodak, of all companies, and he was bringing these people to meetings with the Kodak leaders, and behind the scenes, he was trying to negotiate a payment for himself. This is the same thing that we're seeing in communities across the country. They use this Black pain, this Black anger, the sense of, the man is holding us down, and they begin to organize around their agenda without people realizing it. If you look at cities across the country, like California, Detroit, Flint, Michigan, these are all cities that have been controlled by Democrats for a number of years. When I worked in the Washington, D.C. office, Acorn had been in that community for almost 40 years and nothing had changed. Why? Because they didn't want it to. Bill Clinton and Wade Rathke had been friends since they were in their 20s. That is mentioned in the movie The Organizer. So when Bill Clinton became president, why did we have the 1994 crime bill? When Barack Obama was in office, why didn't he do more for these communities? Why? Because they needed these communities to stay in constant crisis. If there was ever a solution to these issues, then they wouldn't be able to organize the people around their agenda. So they needed to make sure that they stayed angry, they stayed frustrated, they stayed poor. So all of the policies actually weakened these communities. It never helped them. And that's exactly what we're seeing across the country right now. So now this slide is important because if you look here, it says they have over 1,000 local progressive leaders. What does that mean? Well, let's look at one of them, Bill de Blasio, out of New York City. He was elected mayor on the Working Families Party line, and that's in large part due to John Kest, and we'll get into him in a minute. But de Blasio is basically beholden to the Acorn people and the Working Families Party. And as we've seen over the past year, just over the past year, the crime rate in New York has gone up. The police budget has gone down. There have been frequent riots and protests. The economy, the crippling lockdown, New York has gone back to just despair, disrepair. It is horrible. So when you think about this, why would this be the case? Why would you destroy a city that was thriving unless there's a reason behind it? So look at the other cities across the country that are controlled by these local progressive leaders. They're all in a state of disrepair or chaos or have some of the strictest lockdown measures in the country. There is a reason for that. They are destroying the economy. They're trying to get to that annual basic income. And we'll talk more about that in part 3, but you have to understand that this is all part of the strategy of manufactured crisis, getting elected officials, having people in academia like Frances Fox Piven, having your nonprofits, your NGOs, and of course your media all working together. Now, where does all of this money come from? Now, Center for Popular Democracy does have a lot of donors, but we're going to focus right now on the Democracy Alliance. The Democracy Alliance was started by a Democratic consultant named Rob Stein. Now, it's not really a 501c3 organization, and basically it's a donor-advised fund that allows them to funnel millions of dollars between their donor groups without much of any type of accountability. You've got Taco Bell heir Rob McKay, Drummond Pike, Ann Bartley, Rob Reiner, and of course, George Soros. All of these people have come together to push their liberal version of what America could look like. Drummond Pike right here has been friends with Wade Rathke since the 70s, and Tides Center and Tides Foundation, we'll get into that, is an integral part of their system. So there was a time when it was pretty much openly known that George Soros controlled the Democrats and his Open Society Foundation, to the point where Saturday Night Live did a sketch on him, calling him the owner of the Democratic Party. Now, the problem now is that at any time anyone talks about Soros, it's labeled a conspiracy theory. There was even a segment on Fox News where Soros was brought up and the subject was changed immediately. Now, as someone who worked at Acorn, I had to reconcile the donor records. So I remember a lot of the donors, the Ford Family Foundation, the Rockefeller Family Fund, the Sandler Family Foundation, Ann Bartley, Herb and Marion Sandler did a lot of work with Acorn. I could go down the list of some of these organizations that gave through the Democracy Alliance to cover up their money. So the Capital Research Center brings out a good point as to why this is important. Rob Stein said that it is crucial to control the White House. And I'm going to just read a little bit of this. The reason why it is so important to control the government is because the government is the source of enormous power. Now, if you read down a little further, he says it spends $3 trillion in a year. That number is larger than the gross domestic product of all but 4 countries on the face of the earth. They're pretty much out in the open about their power grab. They're not hiding these things, and they're working towards an agenda that, while projecting it on others, is exactly what they're doing. They talk about not being authoritarian or fascist, but this is exactly where they're going. They want to become the largest nanny state, basically, by controlling the country and the world. So let's talk a little bit more about the Democracy Alliance and some of its members. One of the main members of the Democracy Alliance before their deaths were Herb and Marion Sandler. Now, the Sandlers were listed in the Time magazine as 25 people to blame for the housing crisis. Now, that article has disappeared, but because of the Wayback Machine, we have it right here. Now, during this time, Acorn and Acorn Housing were providing adjustable rate mortgages across the board, working with Wachovia, Bank of America, and the Sandlers were part of this. Their adjustable rate mortgages that were through Wachovia were part of the reason that we had the financial collapse and the housing crisis of 2008. Of course, that ushered in Obama and his bank bailouts and some of the worst financial policies of his presidency. So they, of course, were also noted and known for what they did, to the point where Saturday Night Live did a sketch and called them people who should be shot. But all of that information has been wiped clean, and this is why. Before his death in 2012, Herb Sandler started ProPublica, an organization that the New York Times said was a new kind of investigative journalism. Now, if you look down a little further, you'll see that the Washington Post, Jeff Ling, said, "They bring us ideas and we choose from their menu." Now, this matters because some of Acorn's biggest donors, Herb and Marion Sandler, have created an organization that is now reported on everything from COVID-19 to Black Lives Matter to the peaceful protests and everything in between. Now, the links here on this page will take you to some of the things that you should look at, including the 30 international foundations funded by Soros, the media outlets, things that most people do not realize, but if they're right there behind the scenes. ProPublica even won a Pulitzer Prize this year, along with the New York Times. And if you look at some of their investigations, and I use that term very loosely, it's just a host of liberal and lefty causes, opposition hit pieces in order to push their narrative and their agenda. This here is a screenshot from Trump Inc., which is a series that they've put out there that is pushed, of course, by ProPublica and their 14-person journalism advisory board that includes the New York Times, Boston Globe, Seattle Times, ABC News, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the Knight Foundation. All of these people are working together, and you have to wonder why. Well, they're pushing a narrative. There's no such thing as neutral press anymore. You have the Center for Public Integrity, which sounds like it's, a really good organization, but when you look behind the scenes, it has the same cast of characters on the board and includes Arianna Huffington. Over the past 6 months in particular, they have been pushing a narrative of new normal. They have been ignoring the actual COVID death rates. They have been pushing things into a sense of crisis, pushing lockdowns, mask mandates, saying that people who don't wear a mask are psychopaths. And the Center for Popular Democracy even received a grant from the Gates Foundation. All of this is connected here, ProPublica, all of the usual suspects. There's a link for the article where I got this from at the bottom. So how does this work? So it's not just about just giving billions of dollars to these organizations. There's a strategy behind it. So Soros funds the organization. These organizations are led by progressive thinkers, which are really just radical liberals who are in line with the manufactured crisis strategy of Cloward-Piven. Now, they create messaging and a narrative for everything. And that messaging includes reports. If you go to the Center for Popular Democracy's website, you will see a slew of reports on everything from defunding the police, Black Lives Matter, the Federal Reserve. There are at least 8 reports on the Federal Reserve. And we have to wonder if the Fed Up campaign had anything to do with the coin shortage and the push for digital currency we're seeing right now. Now, once these outlets have the stories posted, they push them out to other outlets. So everyone is basically putting out the same story. They're copying and pasting it. You don't see any real investigative journalism anymore. Everyone has the same story, just printed over and over again. Now, once these stories are carefully crafted, they make their way to social media in every outlet possible. And these are also the fact checkers, the people that are saying your news has been checked by the fact checkers and it's incorrect, or your comment can't be posted. Now I'm going to take a moment here to dive off into another direction for a second. The other night I was watching a movie called The Great Hack, which talks about Cambridge Analytica and their scandal. Now that's some of the biggest projection that I have ever seen in my life. Back in 2005, I was working for Acorn when we had this thing called the V-Base. We had Palm Pilots and would go out and knock on doors and collect information. V-Base became the voter activation network. The van was one of the reasons, NGP van was one of the reasons Obama got elected. NGP van and also Catalyst, which is a data collection company which paired with Rock the Vote using Facebook APIs and apps. Same thing that they were pushing, that Cambridge did, was they were doing this back in 2006, 2008, 2012. They have some of the best data collection out there. They were working with the Nielsen ratings company, and they were pulling your TV watching data. They were psychologically profiling people. They were going after the independent and undecided voters and placing stories out there in order to target them. So when you talk about data mining and data integrity, we really need to be looking at the left, because they've been doing this for years. And right now they're going after Facebook because of what happened with Cambridge. And they're saying that Facebook is a trust and needs to be broken up with antitrust legislation. Zuckerberg had to appear before Congress. And now you have Facebook coming out with these new rules saying that they could be legally held liable for the content on their sites. Where does that come from? Well, Center for Popular Democracy is one of the groups that's part of that alliance. And they're basically doing this because they want to silence the people that are putting the truth out there. If they can go after Facebook for their content, that means Facebook is going to censor you. That means they're going to take down your comments and your content. They're going to remove your profile. This is all part of the plan, because the narrative can't be changed. They don't want people who are going to expose what they're putting out there. They've spent billions of dollars on this. So of course these things are going to be labeled fake news, and people are going to be told that they're conspiracy theorists. So before we leave this topic, I want to talk a little bit more about Drummond Pike. As I stated, if you look at the video, the movie, The Organizer, you'll see that Drummond Pike and Wade go hand in hand. If you go to chieforganizer.org and do a search of Drummond Pike, he's all over Wade's blog because they're working together. Now, it says here, Tides behaves less like a philanthropy than a money laundering enterprise. They're taking money from other organizations and spending it on donors, but they're making sure that they keep these anonymous, because it's important. These people don't want to be connected to these far left causes that they're funding. And of course, George Soros sits right behind all of this. So just keep that in mind, that these organizations have some of the biggest funders out there, going back to Tides and going back to Soros. We're going to do a little bit more into Tides Foundation, but keep in mind that Pike and Wade Rathke have put this together. So Wade comes off as a good old cowboy who's driving a 15-year-old truck, but he's got a billionaire friend who goes around the country with him. So don't believe everything you see when you watch that movie. And I know I had a moment too where I was really kind of nostalgic, because when I was working there, I believed that we were helping people. I believed that those issues that they put out there, the things that they said they were doing, that we were actually going to make change. But the more I was a part of it, the more I realized that they didn't want change, because if they did, they wouldn't do some of the things that they did. So while Wade is charismatic and he pulls at your heartstrings, he is a man that is sitting with a lot of power, and some of the most powerful people in the country while organizing poor people without a voice. And that's very important to note. So before we go, I want to leave you with a couple of things. One of them is this report from the Opportunity Agenda, which is a project of the Tide Center. They published a toolkit called Vision, values, and voice. This is what I was talking about when I was saying they set the narrative. This is all about the messaging and the framing of the story and how they're going to talk about their issues. And in the middle of this 7-year-old document is the phrase, "We're all in this together." How many times have we seen that over the past 6 months? How many times has it been pushed out there in the media and on TV and on websites and companies? I mean, Acorn had Morgan Freeman narrating their stories back in the 80s, so you don't think they have the power to make sure that everyone is following the same messaging? And then the last thing I want to talk about in this section is this photo right here. It's from 2014. It looks like it could be from a protest that happened last week, or yesterday. But this is what predictive programming looks like. This is how they get out there and they push an agenda that leads to manufactured crisis because they create the crisis. We're going to delve more into that in part 3 with the coronavirus response, the race riots, Black Lives Matter. Everything that is happening right now is a part of an agenda. It is a crisis that has been created during one of the most important elections in our lifetime. And there is a reason why we are still in emergency mode, while we're still operating in crisis, even though the government's own numbers tell us we should be back to normal. It's because they have created a new normal and they want to keep us there. So that concludes documenting the radical leftist agenda part 2. This is the appendix, and I'm just going to go through this very, very quickly. So this gives you a little bit of background on the organization. This is the movie I was telling you about, The Organizer. This acorn mask here is just really scary, considering that these groups are supposed to have disbanded back in 2010, but no, still doing their thing. This is the map of Acorn International, so you can see how Acorn is across the world. You've got Gary Delgado, Bertha Lewis, Zach Paulette, Craig Robbins, Madeline Talbot. I'll stop here for a second. She's one of the most powerful people in Chicago organizing. She's also the person that brought Barack Obama into Acorn. Look a little into her background. Brian Kettering. Here, I'd just like to note that Kettering is part of the WikiLeaks John Podesta emails. If you go there and you just search Kettering, you'll see some of the emails between Kettering, Podesta, and you may even see some other Acorn leaders in there as well. Steve Kess, John Kess, as I was telling you, started the Working Families Party, was responsible for getting Hillary Clinton elected as senator, even has a street named after him in New York after his death. And Kess is so important that we have 3 pages on him. And like I said, this is a data dump, guys. Lots of quotes, lots of links. It's just for your research. Then we go into some of the usual suspects here that are in the organizations that they're involved in, former diplomats, Obama insiders who now run the Open Society Foundation. That's worth some time looking at. And at the end, we just put in a little article here that ties in some of the other organizations and groups that are working with CPD. Part 3 will have much more. But I do thank you for your time today, for sitting with me through this, and we'll be back again. Bye.